So, welcome to our workshop tonight, Getting the Best Out of Your Relationship with Your Child. I'm Dr. Beth Mosley, a consultant clinical psychologist. Today, presenting with me are Emmy
Dr. Emmeline Guaspari, a principal clinical psychologist.
And Tom.
Hi, I'm an assistant psychologist. Oh yes, and my video is working.
Great, thanks, Tom. And Tom, we've got Tom here today, and we're gonna be doing some role plays later on in the session. So Tom is going to join us again once we do those role plays. So I'm going to hand over to Emmy, who's going to take us through the first half of the workshop and then hand back to me.
Great, thank you, Beth. So the aims of today's sessions is about understanding the link between emotion, relationships, and communication. So we're going to consider the importance of how things are said today and what the impact of that is with our young people. So as Beth has already said, we're going to present some of our session today using role plays. So that's when Tom's going to come in again a bit later. And we really hope that you're going to be as interactive as possible via Slido, because that just makes it much more interesting and much more helpful all round for all of us, you and us included. So we're going to also then kind of think about talking about 6 effective communication strategies to try and help to get the most out of communicating with your child or young person. So that's what we're going to focus on today in today's session. So the power of relationships and communication. So there's just 2 quotes on this slide really to think about. So what we know is the single biggest predictor of overall happiness and well-being is positive and supportive relationships with others. So that's what kind of the research shows us. And good relationships protect our bodies and our brains. So they're really, really good for us. And as we go through today's workshop, you'll kind of see, hopefully, we'll see that sort of features in your responses today too. So we're going to start next with some Slidos. So what I want you to do is think about when I'm in a bad mood, I get more easily annoyed with others and thinking yes, no, or sometimes. So thinking about who on this call finds that when you're in a bad mood, we get more annoyed with others. I certainly do. I'm going to confess to that. Okay, so 100% of you, that's a definite kind of people going, yeah, that's definitely true for me. So the next Slidos, we've got a series of Slidos at the minute, just to get us started in the workshop. So thinking about, does how things are going with friends and family affect you? So when things are going well with my friends or family, I get stressed or moody. So when they're not going well with your friends and family. Okay. So a big proportion are saying, yeah, I think when things aren't so great with my friends and family, I feel more stressed and a bit more moody. Not always, though, not for everybody. Okay. So if you're having a good time, though, with your friends and family, does that make you generally feel more happy? Okay. Looks like most people are saying yes. So we've got sometimes. So, and the truth is sometimes it might not be enough, but generally having a better time with friends and family can make us feel better in ourselves. But it doesn't always. So it depends what we've got going on for ourselves as well outside of that, maybe. Okay, so the next bit, we've got a bit of a relationship and mood model here. So basically what this highlights is it's like a 2-way relationship. So mood affects our relationships and relationships impact our mood, which further impact our relationships. So it's kind of totally interlinked and kind of intertwined, really. You can probably all think of an example. So maybe it's an interaction with a partner or a friend or a family member. Maybe they say something you perceive to be really critical, or an interaction with a young person. They can lead us to maybe feel frustrated or cross with each other. That has an impact on how we interact, and it affects our relationships and our mood further. A bit like a spiraling tornado, really, of emotions and relationship impact, really. Well, that's how I like to think about it. And I can certainly think of times when maybe that's happened with my children or my husband. You know, maybe my husband said something I didn't like the sound of. Well, then I'm feeling really cranky, aren't I? So, and then how I feel is going to impact that relationship for the evening. Maybe I start giving him the cold shoulder, or I kind of start snapping at him. But then I'm going to feel even more grumpy, and probably he does as well. So you can kind of see how that sort of interrelates and kind of feeds each other and becomes that tornado, because I'm going to feel like that, but so is he, really, isn't he? So it becomes like this kind of vicious cycle, really. So what we'd like to also get you to think about is, when we think about communication, we communicate with lots of different people. And these are just examples. So the closeness circle, which is what this is called, we think about who's important to you, and that this can be anyone, including parents, teachers, professionals, friends, pets, your next door neighbor, just about, it could be your postman even. So it could be absolutely anybody. So some of these people we're really close to, and they're really important to us. Maybe this is our family who you share a lot of time and space with. It might not be though. So this could be different for every person. So this is quite unique to different people. So friends are often one of the most important things, or people, I should say, not things, people, in adolescence. So how these relationships are going, and if they've got friends at all, can really influence them, because it becomes a real big driver, particularly in adolescence, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the idea of the closeness circle is that people closest to us have the biggest impact on us generally. Because actually, if the neighbour says something weird to us, we might not be quite so bothered. But if your partner or your child or your mum, or that who may be a bit more closer to you, says something, it might impact us a little bit more, whether that's positive or negative for that. So we're going to think a bit about who's important to you in your life. And you might later want to also think a bit about your young person and who maybe is in their circle of closeness, but we're not going to do that in this workshop, but that might be just a helpful thing to think about later. So you can choose more than one option on this slide, eh? So no judgment about your choices. If your pet is your favorite, most important person in your life, that is totally cool with us. So have a little think about who is most important in your life. Okay. So lovely variety at this point, isn't there? Just give a few more minutes to people, because it kind of keeps jumping about a little bit still, doesn't it? Okay, so that's so big proportion, sort of thinking about maybe a mum, a friend, best friend, could be a father. So there's also importance about boyfriend, girlfriends, or maybe other family members. Okay, so those are the people that you feel are really important to you. So maybe later think about who's really important and close to your young person. So, but who has the biggest impact on your mood? So maybe try and choose one on this page. Maybe when things don't go so well or are particularly going well. So maybe think about who has the biggest impact on at those times for you.
I think boyfriend, girlfriend can be partner as well.
Yeah, of
because
course.
I think these were originally designed for young people, weren't they?
Yeah. Although people might prefer boyfriend, girlfriend, you never know. So a little bit like I was describing about my example earlier with my husband. Not that that was necessarily a specific example. So kind of maybe your partner has the biggest impact on your mood, whether that's negative or positive doesn't really matter. More difficult communication often has a negative impact on our mood, and of course, more positive communication has the opposite impact. So I guess those people who are really close to you and have the biggest impact on you have the biggest influence on your mood potentially. What I'd like us to think about next is thinking about what challenges children face and what challenges then teenagers face, because I'm just mindful of the audience. We sort of had some people who had children under the age of 10, and we had that group between sort of 11 and 13 or older potentially. So I'm going to just very briefly touch on challenges children particularly might face. So they might be learning to understand and express emotions effectively. So it depends on their age, of course. If they're really young, they might be adjusting to being in a structured learning environment. So maybe nursery or primary school. And they might have learning struggles. So not all children have the same learning styles, and they might have differences differences can leave kids sort of feeling like they're struggling. So it might be that they're struggling with attention or concentration, and can lead to sort of constant tension, fatigue, or irritability. So that adjustment to kind of school, and if they've kind of struggling in that kind of environment for any reason, can become quite a challenge for our young children. Now, the impact of the pandemics had also quite a big impact. And so according to Save the Children, an estimated 170 million kids are still out of education due to COVID-19. This is on top of 260 million children who were out of school even before the pandemic. So that's a big challenge, I think, and a big impact of that time. So now children also face that kind of challenge of developing new relationships with adults and peers outside of the family home. So we're kind of setting them on their way, and they're kind of having that challenge of separating from us potentially, but also meeting new people and building new relationships and trying to create that sense of safety away from us. So children today are also under a lot of pressure, more pressure than before potentially. They're bombarded with images and messages on social media, so depending on the age of your child, of course, and in the media or from their peers about the image they should portray. So there's a lot of pressure about it. So if you think about what's portrayed on social media, what do we see? Lots of kind of changed images. So that can often lead them to feel maybe inadequate, anxious, or low in mood and low in self-esteem. They can experience a great sense of pressure with that. So children are more likely to suffer from social problems like bullying, isolation, and poor self-esteem, as they tend to believe what they see and hear rather than us adults in their world. So bullying and harassment can happen in person, but also anywhere and anytime due to kind of that social media. So those are some of the challenges and pressures young people might be facing today. So if we think about teenagers particularly, they of course face a lot of challenges, and we can probably all remember our teenage years ourselves. I remember finding that quite a challenge. Now, what happens in our teenage years is that there's a lot of physical changes, including brain chemistry, and the brain starts to operate quite differently. So there's a need for developing kind of more independence, more autonomy in that kind of adolescent period. And they can become much more sensitive to negative feedback. And in fact, there's sort of research that shows if you show teens pictures of neutral faces, they will often say that those people are really angry. Whereas if you show those images to children and adults, they don't see the same. They kind of don't see it in the same way at all. The teenage brains are busy looking for signs of kind of that people are unhappy with them. So looking almost for that threat in us, really. So friendships and peers, like we touched on earlier, are most important in this kind of phase. So adolescence is the most important time for building relationships and becomes their key focus, really, quite often. So relationships outside of the family home become more dominant, trying to learn to get on with life without our parents. So that transition to adulthood. So it's a really tricky one because we might still see them as our little child, but they want to be that adult, but equally still be that child. So it's that really kind of confusing kind of transition period. But they're striving towards that independence. So the key here is to think much more of being a coach rather than a manager. Bit of a football pun for the evening, isn't there? So we help them to make those decisions. They want to find things out for themselves and want that respect from us as adults. But it can be really, really hard because we can end up kind of in a lot of conflict trying to negotiate this with our teens. And also, we can also really disagree with their choices and think you're making a really unwise choice. So that can be really, really challenging. Or we might have kind of might be seeing them make the same mistakes we made. So it can be really hard battle, sort of giving that respect and independence when we still want to look after them and protect them at the same time. Okay, so what I'd like you to do next is really think about what challenges has your child or teen faced? can't remember if you can have multiple options here, Beth. Can you remind me? Was it just, I'm assuming they can have multiple answers. Yeah. Okay, pressure of school is a huge one, isn't it? Losing someone close, that's very sad. Yeah.
It's a funny time, isn't it? Because it's the end of term. A lot of young people have finished their exams, but then there's also the anticipation of summer
What
holidays,
next? Yeah,
followed by a potential lots of transitions into new schools or new teachers for young people.
absolutely. So we've got about 48% sort of the top one about fighting and falling out with friends. And like we've already said, connection with friends is often the kind of most important focus for teens, particularly. So if that's your teen, but connection with friends are kind of most common difficulties that young people face, really. Switching schools, moving to high school. We were just talking about that yesterday and today, weren't we, Beth? That's such a strong feature, and lots of young people struggles at the moment. Or lots of pressure at school. I remember talking to somebody who said, I joined high school and all they talked about was GCSEs already, and there were several years to go. So losing someone close. So there's a lot of kind of different challenges, and I know we've got some more further down that our young people face. Okay, so some of you might have, if you've joined a workshop of ours before, might have already seen some of this before. So this is kind of about emotions can make it difficult to communicate. That's the focus of what we're going to talk about here. But this is basically the brain house, and it's an adapted version here. So, and what we want to think about is something called flipping the lid and how that affects relationships. So basically, emotions can make it really hard to communicate because of how our brain operates. So it's not a weakness in ourselves, it's just how our brain functions. So in this kind of picture, you can see a downstairs. So if you look at the left, you can see a downstairs part of the house, and that's part of our brain. So this is just an illustration. And that's the emotion center. So where our instincts and emotions kind of really kind of take shape. And so when we're really little and we cry, that's how we get something. So that's the part of the brain that's really quite sort of formed quite early, really. So the upstairs part of the house is our reasoning, logic, and language kind of space. So it fully develops in our mid-20s. So what we try and do is we want it to stay connected with that lovely pair of stairs in the middle. Because basically what that would mean if it's really well connected is that we feel emotions, whether they're good or bad, and we can still reason. So we can have reasonably strong emotions, but they don't overwhelm us, and we can still reason and make sense. Now, if we end up in an argument or the emotions get really, really strong, so you might think about a time where you've got really upset, you've got really cross, or, it might be an example even as simple as your kid asks you for a biscuit and it's nearly tea time and you say no, actually, because dinner's nearly ready. And your kid goes, but I'm absolutely starving, and then gets really, really cross and wants that biscuit so desperately. I mean, it's not the greatest example, but what happens at that point is that emotion gets so strong for your kid that that upstairs part of the brain goes offline, and the lid is flipped at that point. So there's not a connection. You can't run up those lovely stairs to the upstairs. So we can't reason, we can't talk particularly well about things. So that becomes a real struggle. Now, but that can also happen to us when we interact with our children, because you might end up in this argument about this biscuit before dinner, and your kid won't see reason. You're just getting so frustrated, going, look, I'm making dinner. You won't eat your dinner if I give you that biscuit. So you might kind of notice you're going to get really cranky with your child. So you can kind of see how it affects the relationship in that moment. But what's really key is that when we start to sort of notice that maybe we're starting not to think straight, because we can't control our kids in that same way necessarily at that point, that we need to kind of make sure we find some calm in that moment. Now, we have all different things that help us to calm, and it might be like a good hug, it might be, so we really want to think about calming the emotion and having more of an awareness of our emotion and that flipped lid in us and our young person. So we're looking at making that connection at that point before we have that conversation or that correction. So, because if we carry on just arguing about it, it's not going to kind of resolve it. It's just going to spiral into that tornado we talked about earlier. So we need to take that step back and do that connection. So when we flip our lids with each other, it can have that impact on the relationship and can lead us to feel quite bad sometimes, both you and your young person. Okay. So that kind of leads us to thinking, so what you say and how you say it is really critical. So what you say and how you say it impacts on how the person interprets the message, which in turn influences your reaction and influences the outcome and the feeling. And we're going to demonstrate that, or I'm going to demonstrate that by thinking about a parent interaction. So I'm going to ask you to imagine I'm your parent. I know I'm not, but let's just pretend. And I'm going to say something to you, and I'm just going to give you a little trigger warning because you might be a bit triggered by it. You're always on your phone. I never get to see you. Okay, so have a little think about how do you think I felt in that moment? So we're going to do a slide there in a minute. And Tom moves the slide. There we go. Okay, so how did you think I felt in that moment that I said that message to you? Okay, absolutely. Yeah. So most people going for frustrated, angry. Yeah. Some people saying a bit sad. Yeah, probably. Okay. Now, the next slide, though, is how did you feel hearing that? Yeah. Oh, that's a great mixture. Love it. So some of you, if I speak to you like that, you're going to feel really angry and we're going to have that tornado. Sorry, Beth.
And I knew it was coming.
I know. So some of you might be really reactive, get really angry in turn because I've spoken to you in that way. I promise I'm not deliberately speaking to you in that way. Some of you might feel really sad. Some of you might feel really frustrated, irritated, maybe even. So all of those different emotions. So you can kind of see the impact of how I've spoken to you in this moment hasn't elicited very pleasant emotions necessarily. Okay, now I'm going to do another take on this. I'm going to ask you to imagine I'm your parent again, and I'm going to say this to you. You're always on your phone. I never get to see you. How do you think I felt this time? Let's get Tom to move this slide. There we go. Okay, so most of you think I felt really sad in that moment. Some of you also said maybe a little bit angry. Maybe some also said a bit calm. So that's really important. So actually how we kind of say something has a really big bearing, doesn't it? So how did you feel hearing that this time? Okay, so we can see quite a big shift, can't we? Just by changing how I've said a very similar message, really. So actually that made you feel sad as opposed to feeling really angry and frustrated largely. Some of you still felt frustrated and a bit angry, but actually most of you sort of felt that sense of sadness in what I was saying. There was a bit of calm. Also, somebody said listen to, relax. So actually kind of there was much more of a sense of calm And actually, the likelihood is that actually there isn't that tornado building in that moment, potentially. Okay, so we can see from those examples that what we say and how we say it really matters. It can have an impact on our relationship and in turn our mood, as we've already kind of been talking about. And we kind of can see how well they're linked, really. We'll think now about strategies which can help with this, as we know it isn't easy when emotions are high and we've flipped our lids. And we all find ourselves in that position. So even as, psychologists, we still find ourselves in that position where that still happens in our households. So while this example is called a window of tolerance, and it is a trauma-based example, it can be really helpful way of thinking about when we feel really stressed as well. So we all have a window of tolerance. So that's that big yellow zone in the middle. And the size of that window can really, really vary. So depending on the level of stress or the pressure we experience. So therefore, this window can shrink and it can increase. So it's kind of really movable potentially. So this is true for all of us. So we can shut down and we can escalate when our lids are flipped. So if you think about times when you've had an immense amount of pressure, your window is likely to have been much smaller. But when you kind of feel more relaxed, you maybe kind of feel more resourceful, you maybe have a lot of good support around you, that window of tolerance might feel a little bit bigger. So if I think about a really stressful week where I haven't stopped, my window of tolerance when I get home might be a little bit smaller than when we go on our holiday and we have a bit of a nicer time potentially, and there's fewer stresses. Now, our children can respond to what happens around them and how we communicate with them in different ways. So some may go into what's called hypoarousal. So that's when they kind of zone out, space out, feel numb, frozen, and they kind of seem quite unresponsive sometimes to us. So that's what some people do when they feel really stressed. And people get very confused by this sometimes. Or they can go into something called hyperarousal. So that's that red box at the top. So, and what it might be sort of illustrating at that point is they get angry, anxious, they maybe shout, get very reactive. So that's kind of that sort of more explosive version, really. So that kind of opposite. So we just wanted to kind of demonstrate this just to show that we can respond to kind of stress and kind of conflict in very different ways, really. Okay, and I'm going to hand you over to Beth, who's going to take you through the 6 strategies, communication strategies next.
Great. So what we're going to try and do is take you through these 6 communication strategies, which have been developed by a group of psychotherapists. One of them's called Young, and there's another load of them, but Young's the main publisher, main author, documented in their interpersonal psychotherapy and adolescent skills training. And actually in the book Happy Families, which happens to be a book that I've written, is published by Pam Macmillan, there's a whole chapter which specifically goes into detail across each of these 6 communication strategies and gives really nice clear examples. So the 6 strategies are: strike while the iron is cold, I statements, be specific, have a few solutions in mind, put yourself in their shoes, and don't give up. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go through each of those strategies. We're going to use role play to help illustrate them. It might be a bit cringy, but please bear with us because we're just trying to make it come a little bit more to life for you. So the first strategy is strike while the iron is cold. And this is very much about picking the right time to have a conversation. So as Emmy talked about earlier on, when lids are flipped or we're very sensitive to having our lids flipped, that's often not the best time to have conversations about difficult topics or make decisions about difficult things. Often our children or teenagers are coming to us asking us for something, and we might not be in the right place to be able to give a good answer. So the things we need to consider when we're thinking about what is the right time, is now the right time, is my mood, so the person who is potentially one part of the interaction, the other person's mood, how distracted I am right now. So am I right in the middle of trying to do work email on my phone, or am I caught up with doing an online shop, or am I trying to cook the dinner and I'm just trying to concentrate on getting out the door for school or work, whatever it might be? Are they distracted? Are they preoccupied by something else? Are they half looking at their own device or in the middle of going out the door to do their own thing? Is there enough time? So if we're going to be having a conversation about something or a discussion about something, have we set aside enough time? Quite often we might want to quickly just sort something out, and we're just about to go out the door, or we're just about to do something, or someone's just about to arrive. And that sometimes can put a pressure on us to speak quickly about something, or perhaps not think so thoughtfully about how we're coming across, our tone, as Emmy was talking about earlier. And is it a private enough space? So are we surrounded by other people? We've got someone else in the room who we know might add to the drama. I know whenever I have conversations with my daughter, if her brothers are around, it's much more likely that it will get more intense, because it's almost as if there's a bit of an audience. So I think thinking about, is it a private enough space? Is it going to enable that person to feel safe enough to have that conversation? We know that if two people are angry, two people have flipped their lids, feeling distressed, it might not be anger, it might be some other kind of distress. One of us or both of us may say things that we later regret. And I 100% feel like the majority of things that I've said to most of the people I care most deeply about in my life, including my children, have been said when I am in a place of having a conversation when it's not the right time for me, and I'm feeling really distressed. So one of the key things that we know is you can try and think about an appropriate time to have a conversation with a young person or your child and ask those questions. But if you're in a place where your child is perhaps, or teen is perhaps, asking to talk to you about something and you just know it's not the right time, you know that it's unlikely to go well, it is possible that you can pause the conversation. So the conversation could have already started and it might be getting a bit heated. So you could say something like, I'm really getting upset now. I'd like some time to calm down and collect my thoughts. Can we talk about this later? And again, thinking about the tone of voice. If you're saying that in that kind of calm, softer way, you're more likely for the other person to believe that you genuinely do want to talk about it later and you're not just pushing them away and rejecting that conversation. And then you can ask the other person. So we were thinking about this with teens, particularly if they're wanting to have a conversation with their parent, how they could actually approach their parent and ask them if they have time to talk about something that is quite important to them, or if they could schedule a time to talk. And we again can do that with our older children, so our teenagers. So a teen might approach their parent and say, Mom, Dad, I'd like to talk with you about something. Do you have time now, or is there a better time later? And then just by doing that, I think the number of arguments I probably wouldn't have had with my children if we'd been able to do that, because quite often my response in the moment is based on me feeling like it's another demand for me to have to attend to and not having the capacity to do that. And then my child or teen being quite reactive to that. So my children have now learned to do this, and I try my hardest to do this with them. So we're going to do a bit of a role play now. I guess the key thing to say before we go into the role play is, if you are going to say, can we talk about it later, and you schedule a time, it's really important to follow through with that. And what happens is, after you've followed through with it a number of times, your child or teen or whoever that person might be, these apply to other adults, will believe when you say that you will prioritize it, and you will follow it up later. And that can again make these type of pausings much easier. So we're gonna give it the role play. So I'm going to hand over to Emmy, who's going to take the role of narrator.
Lovely. Okay, so we're going to talk about a parent, which is played by Beth, who is cooking dinner after Harley, who's played by Tom, has had a bad day at school, so things are starting to get heated.
You never listen. You've always got other stuff to do, and I don't matter.
You know I'm busy and I can't talk about this right now.
See, there you go. I was right.
So the parent has recognized that now is not the best time for this conversation as things are getting more heated. So they decide to pause the conversation.
I'm feeling quite upset right now and I'd like some time to calm down and collect my thoughts. But I can hear this is an important conversation. So let's talk about this after dinner if that works.
This is an example of how to pause the conversation when it becomes heated. Before it reaches this level, you can catch it. So we talked about that earlier, and ask to schedule a better time to talk, which can be negotiated. This can be both for the young person and the parent.
Great, so we're going to move on now to I statements. So I statements are used to tell another person how you are feeling. When we interact with most people in our lives, particularly when we're agitated, we often start off what we're saying with you. So, you're so rude. You're driving me up the wall. This can often feel like it's blaming the other person and can lead to that kind of defensive response that means the other person stops listening and probably feels agitated and angry themselves. It's really hard to not fall into some of these patterns. And even though I know this stuff inside out, I still have to really check myself, even in text messages, actually, not just in interactions with in person. So if we think about instead of saying, you always interrupt me when I'm talking, and instead start with, I feel angry when you interrupt me when I'm talking to you, because it seems like you don't care about what I'm saying. The message to the listener is very different. The beauty of I statements is they kind of give you the upper hand because no one can argue with how you're feeling. So it helps you sometimes gain a bit of power back, especially with someone who cares about you. And so we also help adolescents think about this as they're communicating with their parents or friends. That by talking about their feelings first, they often are in a better place for parents to be able to put themselves in their child's shoes. We always say, make sure that the I statement is attached to an emotion you're feeling rather than you just put I feel in front of you are, whatever it might be. So I feel whatever emotion it might be. I feel sad when it seems like you're being disrespectful, rather than I feel you are rude. So we're going to try that out now with another role play.
Lovely. Okay, so we've got teenager who's played by Tom and his dad who's played by Beth, and they've fallen into using you comments during a heated discussion.
You never do as I tell you.
But you never listen to me.
Can you think as an audience what I comments each of them could use instead? So give a few seconds to consider this. So really have just a little thought. And we're now going to see them using some alternative statements.
I feel upset when I tell you something and it seems like you're not listening.
I feel sad that you feel that I don't listen to you.
Oh, we missed the beginning part of your line, Beth, because we lost connection where I did.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
So, okay. Do you want to say yours again, Tom, then? I did say it. Must be a connection.
I feel upset when I tell you something and it seems like you're not listening.
I feel sad that you feel that I don't listen to you.
Brilliant. So what difference do you notice? It appears much less heated and means both people are in a place of being able to listen to one another.
So really helping with that flipping of the lid, bringing the creating that connection. Because when we talk about and listen, think about other people's emotions, that can often help with that connection piece. Great. So we're going to move on to being specific, which is the next technique. So this is a really tricky one again. These are all very tricky for me. So often when we're having a discussion with someone, or particularly something that might be causing a challenge, we may overgeneralize by saying you always or you never. And we know that by this overgeneralizing, it can actually make a person feel bad and less likely to listen to your message. And then that leads to an argument. And I know I'm really guilty of this. If one of my teens has been particularly disrespectful in their interaction with me, I may come back with, "You're always so disrespectful to me." And the challenge with that is it often invalidates it, because it might not be that my child or teen is always doing that thing. And so they dismiss it and dismiss what I'm saying. The other thing is that it makes it hard to be really specific on the current thing that you might be trying to deal with in that moment. So again, if we want that person to really pay attention and focus in on what we're trying to address, focusing on something in the present moment rather than things that have happened in the past can be really helpful. So in that scenario with the disrespect, I might say, "I feel that you're behaving in a disrespectful way towards me. You've done that this evening, and I noticed that you also did that yesterday morning on the way to school." So in that moment, rather than just saying you're always so disrespectful, I'm giving my teen an understanding of those specific moments. So when you might have something that you're actually wanting to potentially address, and you know it's coming, and you've got a bit of a pre-prepared idea that you're going to have a conversation with your child or teen about something that's becoming a challenge, you can actually think of the specific example and describe it in that way. So this has happened several times in the past week. For example, on Monday. So coming up with that very specific example is really helpful, and it gives you a place to have more of a discussion from, rather than that person just feeling attacked and defensive. So we're going to do a role play again.
Lovely. So in this situation, Emily's sister has borrowed her clothes without asking again. You'll have to pretend that Tom and Beth are sisters.
"You always take my clothes, then I can't wear them. You're never considerate of me."
I don't always take your clothes. That's not true.
So in this situation, things are likely to get heated and result in an argument. Let's consider what Emily could have said differently.
"I'm frustrated that on 2 occasions this week, you've taken my pink top without asking me."
You're right. I only borrowed them twice, but I can see why that's frustrating. Next time I'll ask.
So reflect on the differences in these two statements. We're not asking you to share these with the group, but just spend a minute to really think about how the specifics kind of make a difference.
And we kind of know that we're giving the most extreme responses in terms of the improvement. So we know that it's not quite that simple in real life. But it gives a sense of how subtle changes can actually really make a big difference in an interaction. Okay, we're going to move on now to the next technique. So putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So understanding another person's perspective, whilst also being able to express your own perspective or own feelings, makes it easier to come to a compromise. And I think the really important thing to note about this is understanding is not the equivalent to agreeing with a perspective. I think this can be really challenging if you're trying to resolve something that you're really unhappy about, so perhaps something that's happened that you really disagree on, or has really kind of raised your stress or anxiety levels, or made you feel angry. So then when you're trying to step in that other person's shoes, you might find that really difficult, because you think that if you'll perhaps validate that other person's experience, you might be saying that actually what happened is okay. So I think it's important to hold that in mind. So it involves 2 steps. One, thinking about how the other person feels. So you've got to really try and imagine how the other person might be feeling, and that goes beyond what it might look like in front of you in that moment, where someone might not look like the way that they may have felt or may be feeling in that situation. And then communicating that to the other person as a way to diffuse the argument. And I think this is really challenging if you've got a child or teen who looks exceptionally angry in front of you, or is behaving in a way that is you're finding really, really challenging, because you've got to kind of think about the feeling behind the behavior. So this is an example of a teenager who has an annoyance that their mum keeps pestering them when they go out with their friends and calling them. And this is their way of communicating to their mom, instead of saying, stop doing that, a different way. So, Mom, I know you're worried something bad will happen to me when I'm out with my friends, but I feel embarrassed when you keep calling me. So it's acknowledgement of what mom might be worried about, and then adding to that feeling and how it makes her or that young person feel. So I think if you're thinking about some of the younger children on the call, so we know quite a few people are under 10s, if you're seeing that a young person is really maybe lashing out, hitting or hurting somebody else, something along those lines, or really shouting, we call it name it to tame it, being able to say out loud what you think that your young person might be feeling. I think you might be feeling really angry, maybe because your brother stole your device off of you, whatever it might be. So you're doing that, putting yourself in that young person's shoes. And for younger children, that's really helpful because you're helping them label those emotions with a word so that potentially they can communicate that with words in the future. So again, we're going to have another role play.
Lovely. So in this situation, Justin, played by Beth, and Rob, played by Tom, are having a discussion around Justin feeling left out when Rob plays football with other friends every lunchtime.
Rob, it's unfair and out of order when you leave me to play football with Chris every lunchtime.
But I like playing football, and if I want to play football, then I'm going to.
Justin doesn't want to fall out with Rob. Can you think what might be helpful for Justin to do? We wonder if him putting himself in Rob's shoes would be helpful.
I know that you like playing football and I get it's important to you. So I'm not asking you to stop playing. It's just it would be nice if we could hang out a bit more, as I feel upset when I don't see you much.
I didn't realise that you felt upset. You're right. I could maybe spend some more lunchtimes with you.
Great. So now we're going to move on to the fifth strategy. So have a few solutions in mind and remember to compromise. And this is particularly important if you have a teenager. So often we provide this workshop for young people too, and quite often we may be trying to, particularly in the teenage years, negotiate things that we want, which our teen doesn't want, or our teen wants something that we're not sure about, because there's kind of that challenge around moving boundaries and developing and growing outside of the family home. So we advise young people, and we will advise you the same, that if you've got a particular issue that you know is going to be a challenge, then being able to prepare in advance some ideas of how the conflict could be resolved is really helpful. So coming up with some potential solutions that you can share when you're in that striking while the iron is cold scenario. So may need to be a bit more flexible in the moment with the other person, which is much more likely to happen. That collaboration is much more likely to happen when lids are not flipped and when you're in the right moment. So the key is really just, and this is a really good negotiation trick for work for other adults too, is if you can come up with 3 or 4 reasonable solutions that you feel you could agree to, then you can offer them in your discussion. And then, of course, that compromise that you may be able to agree within that relationship would make sure then that you follow through with what's been decided. So I'm going to hand over to Emmy with an example of how we might do that with the previous role play.
Okay, so if we think back to the last role play, so some of those solutions that you could hold in mind might be for Rob to decide to play football on certain days and hang out with Justin on the other days. That's option number 1 potentially. or for Rob to ask Justin to join in and play football too, if he likes that. Or for Justin to accept that Rob plays football at lunchtimes and they hang out with him during break times or after school. So it's that kind of negotiating and just giving different options and thinking about different options. And I guess what might be helpful, so if you can think about some solutions for any conflict that you might be currently having within your household or at school, just kind of thinking about jotting down maybe sort of 3 kind of possible solutions to one of your kind of areas of conflict. We're not asking you to share that with the group, but this is just something that you could do in kind of thinking about your own challenges really outside of here.
And often some of these conflict points that we have in our families are quite predictable. They tend to happen in patterns. So it's almost quite often just sitting down in a calm place is thinking together as a family about, I've noticed that after school things are really tense. We tend to have more arguments. Have people got any ideas about why that might happen? And then people say, I'm hungry, I don't want you to ask me how my day has been, I just want to go to my room and chill out. And then through that process you can perhaps, if you come up with some solutions already before meeting, you can think collaboratively together about how you could potentially change that particular part of the day which is causing predictable problems. And you've then got everybody together sharing ideas and potential solutions. And it really sounds like, oh, come on, that's unrealistic. But I have worked and met so many people and friends who actually been really surprised that when they've got everyone around the table and taken a really non-blaming point of view and done a lot of these other strategies that we've talked about, that they've had amazingly productive discussions as a family, and then they've been able to come up with some really shared ideas, good ideas on how to resolve the problems.
And I guess the timing can be really important on this, can't it, Beth? Because I was just sort of thinking, at home, my daughter always likes to talk to me at her bedtime. And that's often the time where she'll tell me about her day and any challenges she's had in her day. And that's often the time where we'll then think about, does she need kind of us to think about solutions before she goes to sleep? So it might just be different for each of your young people, but I just thought that might be a helpful example to think about. Is there a better time to have those conversations?
Absolutely. Right, so we're going to move on to don't give up, which is the final strategy, and we'll be finished very shortly. So we know this is really hard for us all, this thing called parenting. It's so tough. And when we look at those challenges that children and adolescents are facing, and the challenges that we face as parents, managing, negotiating our lives and our other relationships, this is really tough. So the 6th strategy is really try to find a way to not give up. To not give up on your young person and to not give up on believing that you will be able to find a way through some of these challenges. It isn't easy to change the way you communicate and behave in relationships. We often get stuck in these patterns and roles, and it's very difficult to kind of change that. And it can be a bit of a shock when you do for your young people, and they might not actually initially respond in a way that they will once they get into the pattern and the habit of you perhaps communicating in different ways. We can expect to see a difference over time if you persist and keep working to change those interactions. And don't give up on learning new ways to communicate. Find what works for you. We will always make mistakes. We can't get this right all the time. And that's really important, because it's often when we make mistakes, we get the opportunity to repair the relationship, to come back to our child or teen and have a conversation about, I'm so sorry, what went wrong there? And then through that process, that's where we learn more about one another and we learn new ways to communicate. And I think that's really important to remember. We might all be in a family with one another, but we're still learning about things about one another all of the time. And it takes time to work out what works well for mom and what works less well for mom. So there's something really important about not catastrophizing when it goes wrong in your mind, and believing in the power of repair and the opportunity it gives to find a way forward and have meaningful conversations in your relationships. And again, the often with the people that we care most deeply about, the people in the middle of that circle, they're the people who are most likely to potentially have some of these more difficult situations. There's the ones that makes our emotions much more strong. So try not to give up on that. Recognize if something really isn't working with your child. I've got 2 sons and a daughter. Things that work with my sons just do not work with my daughter. She requires a completely different approach. And likewise, I think their dad and me respond differently to different approaches. So there's something about finding strategies that work for us all individually based on our characteristics and certain things that just work better for us. And we may need to change our expectations. Sometimes we might have really high expectations from our young people or ourselves. And I think after a particularly long, hard day, we might expect ourselves to be able to do all of these things that we've just talked about. And it's really hard when you're feeling depleted and exhausted. So there's something here really about self-compassion and being kind to yourself, as well as being able to kind of show that compassion to others. So the last slide is, it's important, a lovely quote from Barack Obama. It's important to make sure that we're talking with each other in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. And I must say, it doesn't feel like that in my family household as much as we try this stuff, because it's often where we see each other at our worst and our best, and where all of our emotions come out, and we are less guarded about what we say and do because we are in a safer space. So this is a lovely sentiment, and it's something to hold on to when we think about the way that we're communicating together with the people we really care about.